Okay, so I'm going to go over the PowerPoint at-home fathers and breadwinning mothers because we didn't have time in class and I want to make sure that I still go over the main points with you. Okay, so when it comes to stay-at-home fathering, we understand the role and understanding in society. It's important to understand traditional gender roles in parenting. So, we've talked about this before. These roles assume that women should be the primary caretaker for children because of this biological argument that they're just much more kind, compassionate, better suited for taking care of children. While men are thought to be ideal breadwinners because they're considered to be more emotionally suited for the world of work than that of women. So, if you essentialize that, well, women are just sweet and passive and frail, while men are strong and aggressive and often don't show any sort of frailty, creating those mutually exclusive dichotomous categories, then, that's kind of what sets up our understandings when it comes to parenting. So, at home fathers are judged more harshly because of this kind of hierarchy. So, let me explain. So, while women have largely moved into the workforce, and some of them are still judged as not as effective as mothers, as stay at home mothers, but still, they are largely present in the work world, right? The kind of normative expectations of women having to be, you know, primarily mothers and not have careers has really kind of shifted in our culture a bit. But at the same time, there's, the numbers of stay at home fathers since 1990 has doubled. So, why is it still that stay at home fathers are considered to be non normative, right? If the system is changing, why do we not accept this? Well, it's because at home fathers challenge this gender hierarchy of the family. So, as a result of that, they're judged more harshly. So, by taking over a female role, they're challenging this presumed dominance of men within family systems. So, gender and power are intertwined. So, as dual career couples negotiate childcare, domestic labor, and their labor force participation, these power dynamics of larger society and these gendered understandings tend to kind of permeate relationships. So, men's power and privilege in the home persists to a certain extent, despite women's increased contributions to household income. So, gender operates on multiple dynamic and interdependent levels. So, in the article, they talk about this idea that they want to look at doing, undoing, and reworking gender. So, basically, taking a feminist and social constructionist approach to try and examine how discursive expressions of gender are intertwined with the social institutions we interact with and those, and are, of course, socialized by. So, they focus on how language shapes and is reshaped by what couples see as possible performances of homemaking and money making. So they kind of want to understand how they negotiate these issues. So the participants of the research were parents, where the father had volunteered to stay at home with their children. And the aim of the research was to develop a grounded interpretive awareness of participants' communicative construction of work and family in a unique marital relationship. So, how do they discuss, understand, deal with the gendered implications of who makes the money and who takes care of the child in the home? So while there's a couple different stances that they argue different family models took, there were four factors that were commonly described among these families. So the first was that both parents wanted their child to be raised in the home. The second was that in every couple but one, the mother's paid work brought in more income than the father's. So, it became a financial imperative to have the woman work instead of the husband. Um, the third one was that every father but one had more flexibility in his work schedule. So, like we'll discuss in a minute, um, it kind of just became a better conclusion or a more workable situation for these families. And the fourth was that they both described the father's temperament as well suited to raising children. So, both the husband and wife thought that, the qualities that this particular husband had were well suited to, raising children, such as patience and kindness and compassion and all of those kind of things that, again, are not considered normative within a masculinized gender role performance. Okay, so the first stance or kind of couple partnering situation that they, basically they used a couple to represent each one of the stances. And so for the first one, they called it reversing, which just means basically taking on the performance of gender non-traditional homemaking and money making tasks. So basically flipping the script on who does what. So he stays at home, she works. So they have both felt conflicts with their new roles. So Scott stayed at home with the child while Alicia wanted to stay home instead. And she initially quit her job to stay at home full time. But while Scott was the primary caretaker, he worked from home and it caused him anxiety that he wasn't providing financially or that his, role wasn't that of breadwinner because, it was his father's role in his family. So he spent a lot of his time, still trying to work and kind of attached to his occupation versus like the childcare and house care that he was, expected to do in that role. So, Alicia, while she was working, actually felt guilty about not being around for her child, talking about how, there's only a certain amount of time and what she was missing and, that she wanted to be in that parenting role. So for them, determining household tasks was a challenge because, basically they had this argument about, well, if the man is doing female chores, then who does the male chores, right? Like we talked about this a little bit, the idea that, in our household, there's this gender division of labor with men typically doing the housework outside and women doing the housework inside, right? So if he's doing the dishes and cleaning, then does that mean she goes outside and cleans the gutters and rakes the leaves and mows the lawn, right? So basically, the way that they switched this out was that as soon as Alicia would walk in the door from work, she would immediately take over childcare responsibilities, and then Scott would just basically turn right then to his working like world. So basically, he worked from home, so she would get home and it'd be like, "Hey, I'm home. Here's a child that you now have to take care of." And then he would just kind of like jump on his computer to do his work. So, later they developed a very specific list of who would do what because the trying to negotiate it verbally was not working for them and there was causing a lot of conflict. So, their identities were still pretty centered on the traditional notions of gender roles and gendered parenting. He was very focused on wanting to be a breadwinner. She was very focused on wanting to be in this mothering role. And so they switched their traditional roles, but not their identities. So this left them at odds with their own identities and created a lot of tensions. So that was caused by this, expected gender roles that they were playing, but they were, flipping that. So then, eventually that was no longer their division. Okay. So another stance is called conflicting. So basically, conflicting describes, having different meanings within the couple for the performance of work and family responsibilities. So basically, not having the same agreed upon definitions, which is obviously going to cause conflict. So, they were both pretty open to changing their roles. Understanding, okay, well, I'm going to take on this role while he takes on that role, and vice versa. But it still caused both of them to be discontented, which is not a good thing. Um, basically, Sue made more money than Mike, and he said it was, quote, the path of least resistance for him to stay at home. So, basically that's meaning that his staying at home was based much more on a financial decision than his own ideological choice to stay at home. While Sue said, she expected only to work a couple years so she could pay down her debt. And then, she wanted to stay at home and do the primary child care. So when it came to flexing his time, Mike would perform the responsibilities of childcare and housework, but he often prioritized his part-time work as a financial planning consultant. And they would have these conflicts when she would think that the house should be clean when, she would get home. And he thought that, she was the only one that was concerned about how dirty the house was or how many dishes were left undone. So he didn't, kind of prioritize that or really take into account as much what her expectations were as she had, kind of taken on that breadwinner role. But, he would still kind of prioritize his own work over that of the housework. Um, so even as the breadwinner, the woman is somehow responsible for domestic matters in this situation. So she still did the majority of cleaning, dishes, and laundry, although he stayed home. And really, neither partner was happy about the arrangement. So, which kind of comes probably from that conflicting expectation of those priorities and the division of household labor. when you expect, like, oh, you stayed at home, it's going to be clean when I come home, and when it's not, and then the response you get is like, oh, well, I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think you're the only one that cares and it's not clean. Yeah, that's not the thing to say. But anyway, obviously those expectations being different just are a source of conflict. Okay, so the third stance was collaborating. So basically, what they mean by collaborating was an approach to work and family that recognized existing gender assumptions while desiring to transgress those boundaries. So there was this idea of holding on to and letting go of gendered meanings and practices. Basically, mean they were always aware of the gendered expectations and meanings attached to what things they were doing or what role they were playing in the family, yet they still defied them on the daily. So, they shared a decision that when Lisa gave birth, Ty would stay at home to raise him. And, because of his career, he was a musician, which gave him more available flexibility. And so, and less income. So it was always kind of decided that he was going to be the person to stay at home. And so, Lisa did value being at home, and she took a full year off after her pregnancy in order to stay at home and take care of her son with Ty there as well. So, with both parents there, which is pretty rare and kind of awesome. So, they both expressed an interest in staying at home. If money was not a concern, they would both like to be there to be around for like the primary care of their child. So their household labor was equally distributed based on their personal preferences and availability. So since Ty enjoyed cooking, he did the majority of the cooking, right? That kind of thing. It was based on, oh, well, you don't mind doing this or you like doing this, so we'll just split up tasks that way. And then based on, how much she was working or when he was available based on his own musicianship, then, he might do more to kind of pull that weight. And that seemed to be a good strategy for them. And what was interesting is that they expressed this sensitivity for what the other one was feeling. So that was like a central feature of how they worked out their family situation. So they worked as a team. They emphasized the equality and respect they had for one another and the roles that they were doing in their son's life. So they saw it as, okay, you're doing this part, I'm doing this part, but we're doing it together as a team, instead of kind of like the previous couples that were mentioned that were dealing with their like specific, own ideological issues in relation to the role that they were playing in the family. Okay, so the fourth stance was what they called improvising. And improvising just meant not using gender as a measure for who should do what in regards to child and home care. So basically, their child required an eye surgeon. So Julie took this lucrative job in a city that had a renowned pediatric eye surgeon, and Bob left his job in a bookstore to take care of the children. So it wasn't really about like, oh, a gendered expectation. They don't really even mention gender in their understandings when they're talking about the language of use. So for them, it was more about, the priority of their child's surgery. And of course, they talked about these different priorities. So meaning that, Bob had a very good patience, personality. He was very, interested and really kind of one of those people that's very good with children because they'll, be patient and listen to them and be involved with what they're saying. And so, you know, basically part of that seemed to be suited for him to take on that role. But then Julie found issues with some of his priorities, kind of like a earlier example where he would, oftentimes not do the laundry as often as she wanted or be behind on the housework kind of end of it from her perspective. And his response to that in the interview was, what's more important, doing dishes or spending time with your kids? So it was just those differing priorities that, kind of had them at odds when it came to expectations. So they did describe their marriage as involving friendship and open communication. So they talked about having this mutual respect and room for difference. So, you know, basically having this strong friendship underlying their relationship helped them, have clear communication and work through a lot of kind of the issues that could have led to conflict or other issues. And they really did challenge these traditional gendered assumptions by mutually agreeing to different roles. But again, in the way that they understood it, they weren't really verbalizing it in a gendered nature. Okay, so then the fifth stance was sharing. So sharing just meant, you know, through their language, they would talk about how they were co providing or co caring for their child. So they both consider themselves to be equal primary caretakers for their child. So they envision themselves as being both working people and parents as well. So they balance these expectations through this idea of shared power and cooperation. So, what permeated their explanations and understandings of their relationships were these words cooperation. So, of the relationship of, yeah, Gary and Sandra. So, they talked about having shared participation in homemaking and money making. So, they were very fluid in their choices of work. They were both, in school, going to school. She was, pursuing a graduate degree, and then he was going to work for a graduate degree, and they're kind of bouncing back and forth. And so when they decided to pick what classes they were going to take, what work they took for employment, and who was going to take care of the kids, was very much, they would not make those decisions independently. It was very much together. They would decide, okay, each other's mutual work schedules, school schedules, things to make that all work out together. So it was a very fluid kind of way that they negotiated these issues so that they could meet the needs of one another. So some of the overall implications was first this role reversal and reversing stance. So this presumed differences in biology and socialization seemed to trump the economics of their situation. So that first couple, Scott's identity crisis of not being the provider led him to move back into full-time employment, and the idea of him being the stay-at-home father went away pretty quickly. When it came to the conflicting stance, they had these atypical gender duties. So they performed these atypical duties, but they felt simultaneously frustrated and satisfied. So they would go back and forth from either maintaining gender expectations and resisting gender expectations, but in that they would find conflict. And when it came to the collaborating stance, they had this idea of holding on to and letting go of masculinities and femininities. So they both acknowledged and parodied these traditional gendered assumption of who ought to do what and, how they should be performed. The improvising stance really kind of didn't even really acknowledge, really letting go of this gender accountability, meaning that those cultural gender assumptions of who does what were completely obscured by the way that they talked about, oh, well, this person's personality is better for this. Like, she just likes to work out puzzles, so she's better at work. And, he's really nurturing and caring and thoughtful, and he should be home with the kids. And so it was about their preferences more than it was about their gendered assumptions. And then when it came to the sharing stance, they consciously resisted the traditional masculinities and femininities. So they were empowered through their chosen resistance to those dominant ways society says families should be organized. And they made sure that they felt that their share was equal, that they were both co providing, that they were both co parenting. And that was how they kind of negotiated that relationship.